Okay, so today we're going to talk about how birds evolve. This will start with a discussion of some of the origins of birds, going back about 320 million years or so, and working our way forward very, very quickly, and then talk about mechanisms of evolution in the context of the class Aves. So your book doesn't quite go this far back, and really doesn't maybe go into as much detail as I'm about to go into on this section, but I feel like your book glosses over something that is of some significant interest and importance in understanding birds. So if we go back about 320 million years, we'd be in the Paleozoic period, and sort of at that point toward kind of close to the end of the Paleozoic period relative to its total length. And at this point in the fossil record, we start to see the appearance of reptiles in the group Sauropsida. So if you take reptiles and some of the stem groups related to reptiles, you get this group called Sauropsida. So you can just you can think of Sauropsida like reptiles et al. Um, Within about 69 million years from that point, we reach a significant extinction event called the Great Dying. So there are these sauropsids for almost 70 million years. Um, they're radiating into various forms, and you have a diversity of sauropsid life. The Great Dying occurs. When the Great Dying occurs, about 80% of marine life and about 70% of terrestrial life goes extinct. This is again one of the significant, the major extinction events of Earth's history. At this time, there's uh, basically significant volcanic activity that is thought to have caused a lot of this extinction event, which changed the chemistry of oceans, for example, and killed the great majority of everything. And that's why it's called the Great Dying. So our focus here isn't going to be on the Great Dying, but what comes after. The Great Dying is the boundary between the Permian and the Triassic, that is the Paleozoic and Mesozoic. And a result of this Great Dying is that the sauropsids that survive the Great Dying now have a sort of blank slate to work with in terms of evolution, because a lot of the competitors that they would have struggled against no longer are alive. They've died off. And so they begin to evolve into uh, various forms. Ultimately, we get what is called the Archosauria from these early sauropsids. And the Archosauria includes both two major groups, one we call Pseudosuchia, one we call Ava metatarsalia. Ava metatarsalia are the things like dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and modern birds. And Pseudosuchia are crocodilians. So we got these two major groups. One of them uh, is including dinosaurs, and the other, of course, is not. So we get to dinosaurs by sort of the very early Triassic period. And dinosaurs themselves can be broken into two major groups, just like we talked about how birds can be broken into two major groups, or archosaurs can be broken into two major groups. Dinosaurs can be broken into two major groups. Um, and so within the Dinosauria, we have the two groups Ornithischia and Saurischia. Ornithischia and Saurischia are, this is a particularly interesting thing to note because it's a little bit tricky. Um, if you look at Ornithischia and you know anything about the roots of the parts of that word, you would you would recognize that it says something to the equivalent of bird-hipped. Um, so Ornithischia are bird-hipped dinosaurs. Let me just point this out here. Bird-hipped dinosaurs. And then Saurischia, well, it means lizard hipped. So we have bird hipped dinosaurs and lizard hipped dinosaurs, these two major clades of the Dinosauria. You would think intuitively that a group of dinosaurs called bird hipped dinosaurs, if you were to argue that birds came from dinosaurs, that the birds would have come from the bird hipped dinosaurs, right? You would think, well, that makes sense. They had bird hips. Um, but this resemblance is actually only superficial, and in fact, birds do not come from ornithischian dinosaurs. They actually come from saurischian lizard-hipped dinosaurs. So this is a point of some confusion early on when you're trying to understand where birds come from in terms of which major groups of dinosaurs. So here we can see this is the phylogeny provided by your book that has the major groups of dinosaurs throughout the Mesozoic period, that is the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. And if we take a look at this period stretching from about 245 to about 66 million years ago, we can see how these clades sort out. So here we have the base of Dinosauria, right? Down here we have a group with purple, or I guess lavender, points all through it. This is Ornithischia. These are those bird-hipped dinosaurs I was talking about. These are not the dinosaurs that give rise to birds. These are dinosaurs like Stegosaurus, and Ankylosaurus, and the ceratopsians like Triceratops. Those sorts of dinosaurs. And then here within the Saurischian dinosaurs, right, we have two groups, the Sauropodomorpha and the Theropods. So the sauropods are what we all would have learned as children, assuming that you were into dinosaurs when you were a little kid, as something like Brachiosaurus, right? Brachiosaurus, the long-necked dinosaurs. These were the largest terrestrial animals ever to live, quadrupedal, and many of them had very, very elongate necks, so some of the more primitive sauropodomorphs, not so much. And again, this group also did not give rise to birds. So it is actually this third group within Saurischia, the theropods, that give rise to birds. And theropods are what you would traditionally think of as things like, if you're thinking in terms of Jurassic Park or something, velociraptors or the T-Rex. They are more upright, bipedal dinosaurs. Now you see within this phylogeny of the theropods that there are different colored points representing different divergences, is what that represents within the group of theropods. And so this square represents all of the theropod dinosaurs that would give rise to birds, whereas this square represents all of the Maniraptorans that are a part of the group of dinosaurs called theropods. So Maniraptorans had some qualities that make them different from earlier theropods. Things like elongate arms, a more ornithischian-like hip, so the hip begins to shift so that it's kind of pointing backwards, much more like a bird's hip, and to various extent throughout this group, feathers. So you start to see feathers within the Maniraptorans. In some Maniraptorans, they were very rudimentary structures. They would have just been like little down feathers and not much else. And in some, they are feathers just like you think of feathers on a modern bird. And then this cluster here represents the Avialae. And the Avialae are modern birds, and all the Maniraptorans more closely related to modern birds than to any other Maniraptorans. So all of the guys in this red square are more closely related to each other than they are to anything outside of this red square. such as the other Maniraptorans. And this is where you start to see what we would really call birds. And we're going to take a look at, here in a few minutes, some examples of what these early forms of bird life looked like, and sort of some of the transitional states that we can see where we have something that's like a half dinosaur, half bird kind of thing. Some general traits of theropod dinosaurs that are found in birds include feathers, a furcula, that is a fused clavicular structure, pneumatized hollow bones, that more upright bipedal posture, eggs which are calcified, the rapid growth of young. There is evidence, at least, of social behavior and nest guarding, and there is a strong hypothesis that that theropods may have been endothermic as well. So all of these features, some easier to show evidence for than others through the fossil record, are traits that modern birds share with the theropods. The most famous of all of the fossils of these dinosaurs, which were really to become birds, the earliest sort of transitional bird fossil is Archaeopteryx lithographica. It is sort of the first bird, if you will, at least one of the earliest examples we have a fossil of. And so these come from 150 million year old limestone deposits in southern Germany. These limestone deposits are remnants of a shallow sea, and basically it's thought that the birds were flying over. Somehow they fell into the water, they sunk down to the bottom, they were quickly covered in a sediment, and they were preserved at the bottom of this shallow sea. And so it created these beautifully near perfect specimens. And you'll see an example here in a minute. The detail is substantial, and they are really striking fossils. On these fossils, you can see things like the plumage, so you can actually see feathers. You can see that the way the skull is shaped, it would have supported a large size brain, and you can see some bird-like skeletal features. But you can also see some things that are very obviously remnant theropod structures. Things like small teeth within the mouth, so not a true toothless beak. Very long tailbones, so we haven't got to anatomy yet, but in birds have a pygostyle. They have this truncate little set of vertebrae in the tail. Claws on the forearm, and some features of the skeleton that were much more theropod dinosaur-like. And so you get this mixture of these qualities between theropod dinosaur-like and avian, modern avian qualities. And this is what Archaeopteryx, an example fossil of Archaeopteryx, I think is maybe one of the most famous images of a fossil outside of maybe a T-Rex fossil that there is. And a couple things you can see really readily, even on this fairly blurry image of it, are you can see the feathers coming out here from the wings, and you can see the long tail that also has feathers coming off of it. And so this is generally what we might consider the first bird, though not necessarily an individual species that is in the direct lineage of modern birds. Some other early birds, well, essentially birds really start to show up in the Cretaceous, and just like Archaeopteryx, they're not necessarily direct ancestors. They're not a part of that direct lineage of modern birds, but they're one of the many offshoots of the earliest birds. An example of that would be something like Confuciusornis, so named for Confucius, found in China. There are many examples of these fossils of this bird, and many of them are preserved spectacularly, like you can see in the example here. You can see those beautiful long tail feathers preserved. It's an incredible fossil for something that came, if you think about from how long ago, we're talking about something that's been buried for about 100 million years. Something extent or significant, let's say, about uh, the Confuciornis fossil is it's the earliest fossil where we see a toothless beak. There are no teeth, so this is even more bird-like than Archaeopteryx is, right? Because it doesn't have teeth like other of the Maniraptorans would have had. It also had a pygostyle. As you can see by looking at this picture, it doesn't have a long tail like the Archaeopteryx had. It has long tail feathers, but no bones, right? So it's a much more bird-like example than Archaeopteryx. A couple other examples are Hesperornis, which is thought to be a diving bird that would have fed on fish, and Ichthyornis. I like this picture. It's a bunch of Ichthyornis around a pterosaur. So just to understand here in this picture, the things that look like a bit like gulls with teeth are Ichthyornis, and this is a pterosaur. This is not the Ichthyornis. It's these guys. And I like the idea this just very well could have happened. Ichthyornis fighting a pterosaur for its catch. It's really, really neat. So you've got these kind of romanticized art pieces, and then you have, the reality of what we actually know about these individuals, which is just their skeletal fragments that we have, and you can see those there as well. Both of these guys had teeth, so in that particular regard, less bird-like than something like Confuciusornis, but still some of our earliest examples of birds in the Aviale. And then we get to a true crown group bird. That is Fagavis. This is a bird that would be considered a modern bird. In fact, it is placed in the Anseriformes, and that was your group of birds that you were looking at, that we looked at in the tag last week, right? The things like ducks. And so this was a duck. This was a duck that would have lived at the end of the Cretaceous. And because of that, you could very well have had a scene like you have here on the right, where you have ducks and some sort of Maniraptoran or theropod dinosaurs running around on the same shore. And it's an amazing thing to think about, that very well could have been a real thing that happened. So again, this is Vagavis. That's Vgavis, if you're wondering how to spell it. And this is the only fossil from the Cretaceous that I'm aware of that is linked directly to modern birds. And so those are just some examples. There are some other fossils that would fall within the Aviale that I think are significant to this narrative, but for time, that's all we're going to cover. The end of the Cretaceous is a rather unfortunately violent end, as the end of most of these major time periods are. We get the Chicxulub meteor impact on the Yucatan Peninsula. That's peninsular Mexico, if you want to think about the geography of it. And this meteor impact is This is massive. It's significant. It causes a huge number of extremely devastating effects on Earth. Immediate effects are things like a tsunami and the throwing of basically hot rock matter, tephra, into the atmosphere. The clouding of the atmosphere it would have triggered volcanic activity. It would have created tremendous winds. Just generally, this was a very devastating impact. And of course, we all know what happens because of the Chicxulub meteor impact. This is what ultimately triggers the end of dinosaurs as the dominant form of life on Earth. And so, much like the Great Dying, this creates a blank slate, right? Just like I said that, the Great Dying created the opportunity for the rise of archosaurs, which would give rise to dinosaurs. We again create this. We wipe a tremendous amount of life off the planet. In this case, we wipe all the giants that dominate the land and the water, for that matter, and we get a reset. Life gets a reset. The life that makes it through this will radiate into new forms to fill in the spaces that were left behind from the dinosaurs and from many other organisms that were lost. One of the real winners in this are the mammals, who from this point on will begin to become a dominant form on the planet. But the dinosaurs don't lose out completely, because within the lineage of dinosaurs we had some birds, some members of Aviale, which would survive the impact, right? And we get then from that impact at the end of the Cretaceous the rise of modern birds. And very quickly you get a diversification into many different forms of birds that are modern birds in the early Cenozoic. So you might wonder today if all the dinosaurs and all the other things that birds were closely related to, like pterosaurs, if they're all gone, what is the closest living relative to birds today? And that's why we started where we started. Because if we think about the archosaurs again, and we think about Pseudosuchia, we would realize that's how far back we have to go to find a common ancestor with birds. We have to go all the way through all the dinosaurs and the pterosaurs, all the way back to the ancestors that birds would share with crocodilians. So today, the most closely related living group of organisms to birds are the crocodilians. All right, so that's the sort of narrative of the origin of birds and how we end up with birds today. So today, in more modern times in the Cenozoic, how have our modern birds evolved? How does that happen? We have to do some really fundamental groundwork laying here. I am assuming that everyone has had some of this stuff in a biology course, but I do want to just kind of touch on it in at least a general sense. First, we understand hopefully what DNA is. If not, I can't really go over that. You have to go back to a general biology textbook and look that up. But DNA, of course, encodes aspects of our structure, of our physiology, not just ours, but all organisms' structure and physiology, and in a manner of speaking, also even the behavior of organisms. Right? Things like hormones dictate behaviors, and DNA encodes ultimately for things like hormone production. So, since DNA affects that, it affects behaviors, and these qualities, structure, physiology, and behavior, are really the major traits of an organism. And populations of organisms have a pool of these traits, and that pool of traits restricts the ability of a population to respond to its environment or to various pressures that might be put on that population. A simple example would be imagining an organism that can only survive for any real period of time, say between 10 and 20 degrees Celsius. So its genetic code only permits it physiologically to survive under those conditions. And so if those conditions get more extreme than that on either end for, say, more than just a short period of time, they start to die. Now imagine if we had another similar species, but in its pool of genetic information, its pool of traits, its temperature range that it could physiologically survive goes from 10 to 28 degrees Celsius. Obviously, it has more flexibility to respond to environmental variation in temperature because of that. So it has more resilience. And ultimately, everything we're talking about today is, or we're talking about when we're talking about natural selection and adaptation and things, we're talking about forces working on this pool of traits within a population. That pool of traits can be added to, and in some cases subtracted from, but that would be far rarer. It can be added to through random mutation. And that is the random opportunity for DNA to change. And it happens in all sorts of ways. Again, that's more of a go back to your general biology or perhaps even a molecular biology course to really investigate the ways the mutation occurs. Several different ways it occurs. For example, it can sometimes happen during errors in replication of genetic information in your cells. But ultimately, the point here, irrespective of which manner that a random mutation of DNA occurs, is that it can add to the pool of traits. Now, this is not frequent, okay? Many random mutations are bad. In other words, when you change that codon in the DNA, or you insert a new piece of DNA into a chain of DNA, suddenly the protein that DNA coded for doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Most of the time, that's a terrible thing. If you're an organism, you needed that protein to do what it was doing so that you can continue to be a living organism, right? It's going to kill you. So most random mutations are bad. Some are neutral. You can have, for example, single base pair changes that don't do literally anything at all. So some aren't a big deal. And every once in a while, you will have a beneficial mutation. But it is quite rare. It's a mutation that creates a new novel protein, and that novel protein ultimately results in some physiological, structural, or behavioral benefit to the organism. And when you do that and you add a new beneficial trait into, or a new beneficial, let's say, yeah, trait into the population, you've expanded its ability to respond and adapt to its environment. Sometimes that new quality can be, can be not just beneficial, but can be so beneficial that the individuals which possess it have greater mating opportunity or in some other way are capable of ultimately having greater reproductive success and contributing more greatly to the gene pool of the population. And that's natural selection. So natural selection is a process in which certain traits, which could be this mutation we're talking about, or a trait that already existed within a range of traits, produces greater survival and reproduction. And the ultimate result of that is that individuals with those traits contribute more genetic information to the gene pool. They get more mating opportunities, or when they mate, they produce more offspring at once, for example. That could be a way that you could contribute more to the gene pool, or they live longer, so they have more mating seasons in their lifespan, right? Any of those things ultimately results in the propagation of those genetic traits into the population. That is all natural selection is. It's the passing on of heritable traits at greater frequencies than other heritable traits get passed on. And so those start to build up in a population. You see more individuals with the beneficial trait because more of those individuals are making babies and they're doing it for a longer period of time. So that trait builds up. We call these traits, when we apply them to the way an organism responds to its environment, we tend to call them adaptations. But really, any heritable trait that's selected for via natural selection process is an adaptation. An example of an adaptation is something like, so this is a snowy albatross, one of several species of albatross that exist. And albatross have a really interesting adaptation for a locking mechanism in the wing, where if you look at the juncture between the humerus and then the radius and ulna, as the wing extends, so as the bird reaches its wing out like this, the ulna rotates a little bit and the radius slides up the ulna. Let's see if I can point to this. It slides up the ulna, and there's a little bump here, and it slides up and pops down into this little socket. That creates a little locking mechanism, and that holds the wing out so that it will stay extended without the albatross having to expend a lot of muscular energy to keep that wing extended. This is obviously beneficial for a bird like an albatross. These are birds that soar tremendous distances and they stay in flight for very long periods of time. And it would be super energy inefficient to have to burn muscular energy to hold their wings out for these durations, especially when you have this highly energy efficient locking mechanism that can do that for you. So that would be an example of an adaptation where energy conservancy has selected for this particular trait, which may very well have arisen through random mutation. There are other birds that have the locking mechanism. A lot of the birds that soar for great distances out over the ocean have a locking mechanism like this. This is an adaptation for long distance soaring. An example of natural selection it's really, really famous is the Peter and Rosemary Grant study on Isla Daphne. So this is one of the islands of the Galapagos, and you have some of the species of Darwin's finches there. One of them is the medium ground finch, medium ground finch, which this graph is depicting here. And you can see in they started a study in the early 70s, and then in 1977, what happens here, the reason this bill size is dropping, what's happening here is we get these drought conditions, right? We get these drought conditions. And in this period up to 77, we see bill size is quite small and even dropping significantly in these birds. And so just as a point of reference, Peter and Rosemary Grant, they literally are out there measuring the bill of like every single bird they can get their hands on. And so they're measuring like hundreds and hundreds of these individuals. What they find this dip right up till the drought. Then there's a drought. And all of a sudden, the measurements go completely the opposite direction. They slingshot upward, and bill size is much, much larger after the drought. And it takes quite a long time for it to level back off. And then at some point, there is a particularly wet season and it drops back down again. And in fact, it drops back down even maybe lower than one might expect. So what's going on here? What is this pattern of decreasing and increasing bill size? How do we explain that? Well, during the drought, all the little tiny seeds get eaten up pretty quickly because the majority of these birds have small bills, and we relative to the average size of this line, let's say, relative to the average plasticity of this characteristic within the birds, they have relatively small bills on average. So individuals during the drought have these tiny bills for the most part, and they can only eat tiny seeds. The few individuals with larger bills, though, have a significant advantage in this scenario because the drought creates a situation in which plants that produce tiny seeds are producing far fewer tiny seeds. So that food resource becomes scarce. And now all that's left are big seeds with tough outer surfaces, which means it is incredibly difficult if you're a small bird to open one of these seeds, a small-billed bird, I should say, if not downright impossible to open those seeds, and most of them die. As a matter of fact, after the drought, the population goes from about 1,400 birds to about 200 birds, because only that last 200 or so have bills large enough to actually open those larger, tougher seeds. And now the population is composed basically entirely of the larger billed individuals. So as they reproduce, well, what's going to happen? Well, of course, what's going to happen is that genetically encoded characteristic is going to be passed on to their offspring. And so those individuals that come later, on average, have much larger bills. And that's how you end up with this sudden spike in bill size. The offspring of the surviving large-billed birds are all having large bills. And so as the population rebounds, the number of large-billed birds is much higher. What happens to start to drive this back down? Right, even here you can see it's dipping back down much closer to where we started before the drought. So what creates this drop? It's the opposite. It's wet seasons. In wet seasons, there is a much greater abundance of small seed relative to a large seed. And so the selection pressure starts to push in the other direction, where being a small-billed bird is more advantageous. It's much easier to get these food resources than it is for the large-billed individuals. And so we start to see selection pressure push back in the other direction again. And ultimately, what this means is, as there are cycles where you have droughts and you have very wet seasons and you have droughts and wet seasons, this means that the bill size in these birds over time is going to follow some sort of cyclical pattern. And the only way that that might get completely eliminated is a very prolonged time period, say, of drought, or a very prolonged time period of moisture, where over tremendous swaths of time, all of the genetics that are retained for small or large bill sizes are completely eliminated from the population. That would be the only way to get rid of that, in which case that population would no longer be resilient to the opposite condition, and that would actually be a very bad thing for that population. It couldn't survive, say, another drought or another wet season, because it no longer had the plasticity of characteristics for bill size it needed to survive. All right, kin selection and Hamilton's rule. While so we're gonna let's just talk about. I think we already did talk about, yeah, we talked about fitness, right? So fitness is um, just your contribution to the gene pool, right? Where if you're very fit, you contribute more to the gene pool than an individual that is less fit. And there is direct fitness, which is your ability to produce offspring. But there's also something called indirect fitness. Indirect fitness is fitness that results from aiding your relatives. And the more closely related they are to you, the more fitness you get for aiding them. In other words, you can get no direct fitness whatsoever, make no offspring, but still net some genetic fitness by helping, for example, raise your siblings. This is a very good example of this that we're going to come to here in a minute. Ultimately, this is something that's not very intuitive, but you share, for example, 50% of your genetic information with your siblings if you have siblings. If you help raise those siblings and ensure that they don't die prematurely and that they're successful in going off and then passing on that genetic information, they're carrying 50% of the genetic information you have with them, which means their offspring will have about 25% of your genetic information. So you're netting some fitness indirectly through your sibling. Um, the idea from this that we can kind of formulate as a rule is called Hamilton's rule. And it's just that if a species helps its relatives, even if it loses direct fitness, the species will still do that, will still help its relatives if the net result in fitness is greater than it would have been had the species attempted to achieve direct fitness. And I think an example will make this form of natural selection, kin selection, make more sense. Let's look at a Florida scrub jay. Florida scrub jays require a rare oak scrub habitat in Florida. This habitat wasn't always rare, but as Florida is a highly populated state and a lot of this habitat has been converted into various uses by man, the habitat is quite scarce now. This has driven a kin selection type of behavior in these birds because the limited habitat size creates very limited breeding territories. And so there's literally not enough territory for all the individuals that are born in a population to go out, form a territory, and breed. It just simply does not exist. And so what happens instead is that some individuals are born from their parents, and instead of going out and trying to establish a territory, which would basically mean having to constantly fight with other individuals, they stay with their parents. They stay with their parents and they raise their offspring. Their parents' offspring, that is. They raise their parents' offspring. That means they raise their siblings, right? They raise their siblings. They have no chance, really, at getting direct fitness. But they do have a way of still achieving some measurable amount of fitness by helping to raise their offspring. This is a time when kin selection kicks in. The opportunity may arise for one of these birds to establish its own breeding territory. Obviously, birds that are on breeding territories do die. That happen, and so when that happens, then another individual will, of course, claim that territory and begin to achieve some, hopefully for itself, some quantity of direct fitness as well. Okay, let's talk about sexual selection. So sexual selection is just like kin selection, is another form of natural selection. And it happens in one of two ways. It can either be intersexual or intrasexual, meaning intersexual is mate choice from the opposite sex. So a female choosing a male or a male choosing a female based on some quality. Intrasexual is same-sex competition, resulting in access to the opposite sex. Usually in intersexual, we're talking about, in the bird world, we're talking about females choosing males. And in intrasexual, we're talking about males fighting each other or competing in some other manner directly for females. And that way it could be something like lekking, where males all get together and display, and the it's a display competition. And so if we frame that competition in terms of the competition between males for females, it's intrasexual. The actual selection that happens is a female selecting the male, so in that way it's intersexual. Um, Intersexual selection always is not always females choosing males. There's something called reverse sexual selection, reverse sexual dimorphism, actually. And let me back up for a minute because I don't think I talked about sexual dimorphism. So let's talk about that. Sexual dimorphism is seen a tremendous amount in birds. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's seen in many other animals as well. Sexual dimorphism is when within a species, males and females possess different phenotypes, different external qualities. So, um, as an example, some actually very simple example, northern cardinal is a sexually dimorphic species. The males are bright red and the females are a much drabber brown color with little hints of red in them. That's sexual dimorphism. And usually it's females choosing males based on the that quality of their coloring, and that's the typical state of intersexual selection in birds. In birds, though, and this is true of other species as well, the whole, or other, not species, groups of organisms, the whole narrative can flip around. You can have the reverse situation. And this red phalarope picture down at the bottom here is highlighting that reverse situation. This is reverse sexual dimorphism. You'll note on the right, the female is the one that is very showy, and the male is relatively drab. And so that's reverse sexual dimorphism. This sexual selection where one individual is showy and the other is more drab is usually driven in the direction of females choosing males that are or males are the showier, because females tend to put more effort overall into reproductive success, including more of the brooding effort, and even raising of the young. Obviously, that's not always true in birds, just as it's not always true in some other groups of animals, but that's a general rule. The energy that goes into doing that and the energy that goes into being shiny and sexy colors kind of offset each other. Intrasexual selection, same-sex competition, we'll look at in more detail here in a minute. But let's look more at intersexual. Intersexual selection sometimes is different in different populations. And so this is an example from your book with barn swallows. So you have 3 different populations of barn swallows. Barn swallows, again, are found in at least 4 different continents, sometimes showing up in 2 others as well. And so here we have in A, the North American typical barn swallow, in B, European, and then in C, barn swallows from Israel. And you'll note one thing that is extremely obvious on these 3 species is the color of the breast. In Israel, it's a very rusty reddish. In Europe, there's almost no red, and in North America, it's somewhat in between the two. This is driven directly by sexual selection pressures for a certain amount of red pigment. Another way to think of this is that if you are a female in Israel, you think the more reddish color is sexier, and so that is what is selected for, and that is the more prevalent phenotype. If you're in Europe and you're a female, you think this white colored breast is the sexier one. That's how it works. And so, because individuals with those particular phenotypes get more opportunities to mate, that tends to be the prevalent color in those different populations. I really, really love this particular topic. It is fascinating and maybe slightly difficult to wrap your brain around, but it's really cool. So here we have a nightjar. I think this is a standard wing nightjar. And look at the female's on the right down there. The male is on the left. Look at the male. He has two long feathers extending out from the wings in such a way that it is basically incredibly difficult for him to fly or to maneuver around because he has these two big awkward things sticking off of his body. Um, but the female likes that. To the female, that's sexy. And so we come to this thing called the handicap hypothesis. Um, there's another name for it, but I'm going to call it the handicap hypothesis. And what the handicap hypothesis is pretty straightforward in all reality. Think about this male. He has this really awkward handicap in that it is very difficult to have those feathers and to evade predators at the same time. It's hard to evade predators when you can't fly very well and you're not very maneuverable. And so the idea here is that handicap is to the female attractive. It tells the female that despite having this handicap, the male has been able to evade predators long enough to reach the point of sexual maturity. And so that's attractive because that means that male's very good at evading predators. Um, and so that's the handicap hypothesis. When you see species that have qualities that are sexually dimorphic qualities, and those qualities seem that they would hinder their survival. Another example of that would be like incredibly bright colors that would attract predators. When you see those qualities, understand that one of the things that may be making them attractive to the opposite sex is the fact that it proves that even under suboptimal survival conditions, that other individuals able to evade predation. That's a sexy thing. So most of those types of, if you want to call them benefits, if you will, are indirect in that a female chooses the male because he's good at evading predators, for example. Or, it could be because all his bright colors indicate that he's good at foraging. That could be another example. Those are indirect benefits. The female doesn't get anything from that directly, right? But her offspring are going to get the genetics of that male, and those offspring then will benefit from those genetics. Sometimes the benefits are actually direct. So an example of this is something like courtship feeding. Here, a male Forster's tern is giving food to a female Forster's tern. And this is it's sort of like I don't know a way to say that doesn't seem inappropriate. It is a gift for sex. Let's just put it that way. I will give you lots and lots of food in exchange for a reproductive event. That's what's happening there. So those are direct benefits. Um, Finally, we get to intrasexual selection. We have a couple examples here of intrasexual selection. So everything previous to this is intersexual selection, right? It's why does a female choose a specific male? Or why does one member of one sex choose a specific member of the opposite sex? Here we have a completely different thing. We have competition between the same sex driving selection pressure. One example of this is an American redstart. American redstarts have a preference of habitat for thick shrubs. They want basically shrub and brush to be very dense. That's where they like to create their nests. And here on the left you have a male, and on the right you have a female American redstart. And this is a migratory species that's breeds in places like West Virginia, where I am. But it has to come from tremendously far south to get here. What happens is experienced individuals, so individuals that are beyond their first reproductive year, they realize that they must get to the best breeding spots first, and they leave for migration earlier than younger, less experienced individuals. And this is true for both the males and the females in this case. Leave earlier to try to get the best breeding spots fastest. The males are going to go and establish the territories, and the females are going to select those earlier males who would have achieved establishment of best breeding territory. And so this is a form of intrasexual selection, where leaving early allows you to outcompete members of the same sex for reproductive opportunity. And then finally, in intrasexual selection, we have an example of very direct form of competition for territory. Most birds will not do this. Okay, most birds, when they compete for territory, they'll fly at each other and they'll be agitated at each other. They'll sing at each other. They'll belt out very specific territorial calls to say, hey, get the heck out of here. Do all that stuff. And usually that's enough. There are some species of birds, though, that will actually fight and potentially fight to the death in some instances to take a territory from another individual, or to defend its territory from an invader. Now, the common loon is an example of this, and this is just a really cool picture of that. Common loons, because they have very pointy beaks, when they get into these kind of tussles, they can severely wound or even potentially kill each other in territorial disputes. But the reason they do that isn't because they're just mad at one another. They are trying to establish an optimal territory to attract a female for a mating opportunity. And so nothing says survival of the fittest quite like this does, because you will literally die if you're not the fittest in this situation. And so obviously, if you're the individual who is more fit in that you're capable of winning a combat, you get the reproductive opportunity. So that's intersexual and intrasexual selection. Your book goes in and has a lot more detail throughout this chapter, and of course, just like every other chapter, you're expected to read the chapter and know the chapter as a whole. I hope that just me talking through this stuff helps you guys understand some of the things in these chapters, um, and maybe expand a little bit on some of the ideas. But please read the chapter, as there are other ideas in this chapter that are going to be on the exam. Now we get to speciation, and this is the discussion question for this week. We were talking about natural selection, which is driving genetic variability within populations in certain directions, right? The greatest ability to compete for territory in loons, or color phenotypes in barn swallows, right? Those are forms of natural selection that we were just talking about. Um, but how does that create a species? Because that's what natural selection ultimately is, can do. It can create new species, new entire lineages out of specific populations. It works at the population level. So my question for you this week is to provide an example of any of these three things, either allopatric, allopatric speciation, sympatric speciation, or adaptive radiation in birds, and then describe what pressures would drive that speciation, and then discuss how the concept of species you identified with last week may be seen in this particular event, whether you chose an allopatric event, a sympatric event, or an adaptive radiation. So whichever of those you pick, you find an example, discuss what drove that speciation event, and then connect it back to your selected definition of species concept from the previous discussion. All right, well, that wraps up that lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.